Hello, my name is Ioannis Kokkoris, and I will be discussing the assessment of non-coordinated effects that horizontal mergers can give rise to under the European Union merger regulation. I am a professor in law and economics at the Center for Commercial Law Studies at Queen Mary University of London. Let's start by asking the central question. What exactly is the focus of merger assessment? And the focus of merger assessment, and in particular of horizontal merger assessment, is whether a merger will enhance the level of market power of the merging parties. How do we see this market power being exercised? It can be higher prices, or it can be other harm to consumers, as it is outlined in paragraph 8 of the guidelines. Of course, we always consider the relevant counterfactual, which is what would the situation be if the merger had not taken place. So what would be the situation in the post-merger market had this merger not taken place at all? So there's a comparison with the impact in the post-merger market that the merger will have versus what would be the situation in that market had the merger never taken place. This is the counterfactual which is outlined in paragraph 9 of the guidelines. The guidelines also distinguish between non-coordinated or unilateral effects and coordinated effects, and I will come to discuss that in a minute. And they also have a list of what is called mitigating factors, which are factors such as barriers to entry, buyer power, efficiencies, which are outlined in the guidelines as considerations that need to be taken into account when we're assessing a merger, a horizontal merger. What are the two main anti-competitive effects that the guidelines describe a merger can have, a horizontal merger can have? We distinguish between unilateral effects or non-coordinated effects, which is a situation whereby a merger will give the merging parties the ability to express the market power now they have as a result of the merger, without necessarily having to coordinate their conduct with any of the competitors. Unilateral effects result because we have a removal, as the guidelines put it, of competitive constraints between the two parties. I will come back to what is competitive constraint when I will be discussing differentiated product markets a bit further down this presentation. But the main point is that you have both merging parties now realizing they can express market power in different ways, higher prices, lower quality, lower quantity, as a result of what is called the removal of competitive constraints. As a result, in a nutshell, of not caring whether they will lose customers to each other of the merging parties. The guidelines also discuss coordinated effects, which is not the focus of this presentation. It's the situations whereby the merging parties need to be able to coordinate their conduct with other competitors in order to sustain a higher price or a lower quality in the post-merger market. What are the factors of assessment? Three main factors. Merging firms have large market shares, merging firms are close competitors, and customers have limited possibilities of switching supplier. The larger the market shares, the more problematic in principle, and I stress that, the merger, a horizontal merger, can be. And it's relevant for both homogeneous and differentiated goods markets. Merging firms are close competitors. Now that's a more important factor compared to the market shares as a number themselves, because if two merging parties are close competitors, that implies they will have a greater negative impact in the post-merger market as a result of this merger. Close competition, as we will see further down in the presentation, is we imply the situation where customers of one of the merging parties would see the products of the other merging party as the closest substitutes to their choices. So if they stop buying one of the merging party's product, they would go to the other of the merging party's product. Now after the merger, the two merging parties are one. This does not exist anymore. This choice does not exist anymore. So these customers are going to be harmed as a result of this merger. So the closer competitors the two merging parties are, the more problematic in principle the merger can be. Customers have limited possibilities of switching suppliers. The whole point of merger assessment, of horizontal merger assessment, is to assess whether a particular transaction will affect consumers, customers. If customers have limited possibilities of switching suppliers as a result of a horizontal merger, that is a negative factor for the approval of this merger. These customers may be particularly vulnerable to price increases. These customers may be bound to either of the merging parties because of long-term contractual obligations. If generally customers do not have enough possibilities of switching suppliers, that in itself is a negative factor from horizontal mergers. Other potential factors which we will take into account. Competitors are unlikely to increase supply if prices increase. Let's think what we would expect to happen in a market if a company decides to increase prices. We would expect to see customers switching from that company to the competitors, to other companies which are producing similar products, in order to benefit from the lower prices the other competitors would have. What happens though if in that market competitors cannot increase supply when you have an increase in the prices of one of the incumbents? Customers will want to switch, will want to go to another competing company, but the competing company will not be able to satisfy the demand because it will not be able to actually increase the supply to satisfy that demand. And that's relevant both for homogeneous markets but also for differentiated markets. Merged entity is able to hinder expansion by competitors, another important factor, very similarly assessed with the previous one. If the merged entity can somehow hinder the expansion of competitors, so hinder the increase in the supply of competitors when you have a price increase from the merged entity, that will imply the customers of the merged entity will not be in a position to go to the competitors for cheaper products, which means the customers of that entity will be adversely harmed by the merger. How can we see that in practice, how this is expressed? In practice, we can have control over the supply of inputs, we can have control over distribution networks, we may have interoperability issues, any practical issue which can allow the merged entity to hinder the expansion of supply from competitors, that will be a negative factor when it comes to horizontal merger assessment. Final factor in the guidelines, the merger eliminates an important competitive force. This is what we also call a maverick. What do we mean by an important competitive force? We mean companies, firms, which will have an influence on the competition in the market, which will not be indicated by their market share as such. In practice, we're talking about smaller, usually firms, very dynamic, very competitive, which have very innovative products in markets. They have very competitive pricing in markets. They, if you wish, they do not allow the market to be stagnated. So customers actually benefit from this innovativeness, from this competitive pricing. Now, these types of firms are deemed to be important competitive forces, are deemed to be mavericks. If you have a merger whereby one of the incumbents is acquiring or is merging with such a maverick firm, that factor in itself will again be problematic for merger assessment. We should emphasize here that there is no particular list of how many factors should be in favor of a merger and how many factors should be against a merger for a merger to be approved. The authorities, the Commission, and the other authorities are going to do a holistic assessment of all these factors, showing whether a merger may be problematic or not. They will also assess, as we mentioned earlier, the mitigating factors, and they will come to a conclusion whether in the European Union, by the European Commission analysis, whether a horizontal merger can significantly impede effective competition. There will not be a static analysis of each of the factors we just discussed. It's a dynamic process. It's an assessment whereby the Commission will take into account all these different considerations in trying to conclude whether a particular merger or acquisition will actually harm the competitiveness in the post-merger markets. Moving on to providing a bit more detail now on each of these factors. Market shares and concentration levels. What we can argue is that very large market shares, 50% or more, on the basis of the case law, may in themselves be evidence of a dominant position. We should also stress here that the dominant position is not a requirement for a problematic merger. The Commission, in several cases, has found dominant positions with market shares in the 40 to 50% range, and in some cases with even lower than 40%. So the merged entity may have lower than 40% market share, and the Commission still deemed that that firm had a dominant position. The guidelines and the regulation, there is, if you would like, a safe harbor, which is if the merged entity has lower than 25%, then this is an indication that this merger will not be problematic. A bit more on the market shares and concentration level, the Commission in the guidelines also refers to the HHI, the Hess-Huisman Index, and calculates the HHI in the pre-merger market, in the post-merger market, the difference between the two HHI numbers, and has come up with this type of ranges whereby if a merger has an HHI of lower than 1000, then that probably will not require an extensive analysis. If the HHI is between 1000 and 2000, in the post-merger market always we're talking about, and the difference between the post-merger market and the pre-merger market is lower than 250, then these types of transactions will raise some concerns. And if the HHI in the post-merger market is higher than 2000 and the difference is lower than 150, then these types of transactions will raise significant concerns. HHIs as market shares are not a panacea, are not going to be the only determining factor of whether a merger is problematic or not. HHIs and market shares are an indication. How do we calculate HHI? It's in the guidelines themselves. It's the squares of the market shares of all the companies in the pre-merger market and in the post-merger market summed up. So it's the summation of the squares of the market shares of each company in the pre-merger market, that's the pre-merger HHI, and in the post-merger market, post-merger HHI. Note here that in the post-merger market, you have one company less because you had two companies which are merging, now they become one. So you had two market shares which you would square in the pre-merger market. In the post-merger market, you only have one market share of the new merged entity that will be squared. This analysis is being done in cases, is being presented in decisions. It has never been conclusive evidence, but it is one of the indications of how concentrated a market is. As a rule of thumb, the higher the HHI, the more concentrated the market is. So what can we conclude from up until this point in the presentation? Whether or not a merger produces non-coordinated effects will depend on two things: the degree of competition between the parties pre-merger, and whether customers will have sufficient economic alternatives. The closer the merging parties have been prior to the merger, the closer competitors they have been, the more problematic the merger is likely to be. The fewer sufficient economic alternatives customers have, the more likely is the merger to be problematic again. But it's not, again, a checklist that we have to tick one or both. It's a holistic assessment that the Commission will actually take into account. The main thoughts here is if the two merging parties are the number one and two choices for customers, then that merger is likely to be more problematic than if the two merging parties are choices 1 and 5, hypothetically speaking. If there are 5 other choices for customers which can provide a sufficient economic alternative, that merger is going to be less problematic than a merger in a market where there will only be 2 sufficient economic alternatives. But all of this will be part of the analysis of the Commission. Why good customers may not have sufficient economic alternatives? Product differentiation. A laptop with a different software is not the same as another laptop with a completely foreign software. And insufficient supply from rivals, capacity constraints which we discussed before. Now we will briefly touch upon the differentiated product settings to understand a bit better how mergers in these markets are being assessed. Majority of the mergers around us are happening in markets where we have differentiated products, and we'll also use this in order to assess how close competition can be actually taken into consideration. So I use the example from the guidelines. Hypothetically speaking, we have purchasers of high quality cars, Audi, Mercedes, BMW, Saab. Again, a hypothetical scenario. All four producers are in competition. That's a pre-merger situation. They set optimal prices given what other rivals will actually charge for the product. So each of these companies will see what the others are charging for the particular product, and on the basis of that, they will also assess the price that particular company would need to charge. And then we have a scenario whereby Audi is merging with BMW. And the question is, what happens? How do we assess now this transaction? Before the merger, companies face 2 sources of loss of sales. So before the merger, companies can lose customers as a result of 2 particular ways of operation of customers. If you have a price increase, some customers will switch to competitors. That happens in quite a large number of markets. A price goes up of a product, customers will switch to competitors. Some customers will stop buying completely, or they will buy less. They will still buy the same product, but they will buy less. They will still buy the merged parties product, but less. Not the same amount as before, because the price now has gone up. Let's assume that Audi and BMW are, how we call it, competitively interdependent. What do we mean by that? And I will come back to the word in parentheses, the diversion ratio. If Audi were to increase prices by 10% before the merger, half of the customers who would stop buying Audi, they would actually now start buying BMW. At the same time, if BMW were to increase prices before the merger, 1/3 of the customers who would stop to buy BMW would now turn to Audi. This is the competitive interdependence we're talking about. Customers of each merging party are moving to the other merging party if the price of the product goes up. Now, what is diversion ratio? Diversion ratio is indicated in this example by the number of customers, by the proportion of customers which are actually moving between the two merging parties. So the diversion ratio from A to B would be 50%. The diversion ratio from B to A would be 33%. It's an assessment of the number of customers that companies will lose if they raise the pricing. The higher this number, in principle, the more problematic a horizontal merger can be. Why is that? Because the higher the proportion of customers which are switching between the two merging parties, the higher the proportion of customers in the post-merger market that is going to be negatively affected if these two merging parties now, operating as one, raise pricing or lower quality. These customers, which are also, you will also see them in the literature or in case are captive customers, are the customers where before the merger they would only choose the two merging parties' products. These would be their best two options. After the merger, these best two options become one, the merged party. So although before the merger they could switch and get another product they liked at a lower price, after the merger they have no choice. Because now we assume that the price of the merged entity, the prices of the merged entity on both products which are still producing, that before the merger would be independent, are actually increased. So these customers are being adversely affected by that merger. That is a description or an explanation of what we mean by diversion ratio. It's again the number of customers, the proportion of customers which are actually switched between the two merging parties before the merger, and after the merger they will have no choice but to stay within the same merged entity and face the higher prices or lower quality. What we care in horizontal merger assessment is this customer switching. The new entity, Audi and BMW, will realize that by raising the price on one model, some customers would buy the other model, which creates the incentive to raise prices on both models, because after the merger, both models belong now to the same entity. Provided that the customers who stop completely to purchase is not a significant part of the merged entity's customer base. Because if the merged entity raises pricing and majority of its customers stop buying completely, that would imply that this price increase will not be sustainable for the merged entity. If the merged entity realizes that by raising prices post-merger, the customers who would buy the two different models of the car will still buy these two models of the car after the merger, will not stop buying, will still buy these two models, but now these two models belong to the same entity, the merged entity will have the incentive and the ability to raise pricing on one or both models. That incentive itself is unilateral, to go back to the unilateral effects we've been discussing, because whatever Mercedes and Saab decide to do, these two companies, Audi and BMW, will still have the incentive to raise their own pricing because of the customers who would switch between the two models prior to the merger, but will not switch after the merger at all from the new merged entity. So Mercedes and Saab can lower their pricing, for example. Still, the customers who would find Audi and BMW as number 1 and 2 will still find Audi and BMW as 1 and 2. So they will still switch between the two and they will still buy these two models at a higher price now after the merger. What happens quite a few times? The competitors of the merged entity, Mercedes and Saab, realize that they can also increase their own pricing. They can also increase their own pricing after the merger. And we have cases where the competitors have actually done so, have increased pricing after the merger, in addition to the merged entity raising pricing after the merger. The size of the price increase will depend on how much lost sales Audi and BMW could get from each other, which takes us back to closeness of competition, to diversion ratios, and the expected price response of the other competitors. The analysis of the effects will depend on trying to assess these two particular impacts that will be on the pricing of the products in the post-merger market. Do all differentiated product mergers lead to price increases? No. We can have competitor reactions, repositioning. I mentioned before the two different laptops. One, let's, for the sake of argument, one is Apple, one is operating on a Microsoft-based software. If competitors could reposition their products, could reposition their offering to make it less differentiated, that implies that someone who would buy only one or the other software before a merger which affects prices, if competitors can reposition their offering to make it more like one or the other, customers will be able to switch to alternative competitors. To take the example of the cars, Audi and BMW merging, if Mercedes and Saab could differentiate their product slightly to make it look more like Audi and BMW, and the cars may not be the best example in this situation, but we can think of a lot of differentiated product markets where slightly tweaking a product can look more similar to another product in the market, which implies that the customers that would in any case not have a choice in the post-merger market now have a choice, have the new slightly tweaked product of a competitor. That's the repositioning example of a competitor reaction. We can have entry by new competitors, we can have countervailing buy power. All of these also are considered as the mitigating factors which I mentioned in the beginning in horizontal merger assessment. All of these will be taken into consideration. And of course, the car example or the software example are hypothetical examples. In reality, competition in markets works on much more complicated levels, but this is the same type of analysis and thinking that the authorities will do in assessing a horizontal merger. Then the other factor we discussed on why customers cannot switch, apart from differentiation, was rivals cannot increase their supply. Non-coordinated effects are not limited to differentiated products. If rival suppliers, if competitors cannot cannot increase their supply to satisfy the customers of the merged entity, that will enhance the incentive of the merged entity to raise prices post-merger, because the merged entity will realize that competitors cannot raise their supply, cannot tweak their supply, their product offering. So that will give them an enhanced incentive to actually raise pricing, both in differentiated products and in homogeneous product markets. Which brings me on to what happens in a homogeneous product market. Output and capacity, as economics are telling us, are the main drivers of the price level in that market. Example of a homogeneous market, commodity markets. Merged firms may have an incentive to reduce output or capacity below what they were producing before the merger took place and lead to a knock-on impact on the price. Before the merger, any increase in that price would benefit that party through higher margin on sales. After the merger, this higher margin of sales will also be enjoyed by both merging parties. In homogeneous markets, the higher the market share of the merging firms, the bigger the effect is likely to be. In homogeneous markets, unilateral effects are mostly relevant when we have capacity constraints from competitors. Because in homogeneous markets, the products are, let's call it, more similar than it would be in differentiated markets in the eyes of customers, if rival firms, if competitors do not face capacity constraints, what they will do, if they realize that the merged entity reduces output, they will increase their own output to satisfy the demand, satisfy the customers of the merged entity which do not have the choice of the merged entity anymore. And because the products are similar, and similar within inverted commas, customers will switch to a competing offering. So customers will have an alternative. Sometimes in homogeneous markets, we also see though that if the merged entity reduces the output, the competitors will also follow suit because they will realize that that can be to their benefit as well as a result of the higher pricing that will ensue in the market once the output is actually constrained from the merged entity and themselves. So just to recap and conclude this presentation, what exactly are we assessing in horizontal merger assessment when we're talking about unilateral effects? It is the unilateral ability of the merged entity after the merger to either increase prices, lower quality, reduce quantity, adopt in general conducts which will be harming consumers. If a horizontal merger leads to a post-merger market where the merged entity can adopt such conducts, that will be a problem for the competition authorities. Competition authorities will need to look into it and assess it in detail. If the customers of the merged entity have sufficient alternatives, if the customers of the merged entity can go to these alternatives, so there are no capacity constraints from the competing firms, if the customers of the merged entity do not see the two merging parties as the two closest substitutes, as the two best product offerings for them, then a merger is likely to be less problematic. There is no list of factors which have to be negative for the merger or have to be positive for a merger to be cleared. It's an assessment of each individual factor, but also it's an assessment of all the factors together on the impact that the merger can have in the post-merger market. Thank you.